Good evening, everyone. I'm Tracy Glab, Executive Director of the FIA, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's virtual Sheppy Dog Fund lecture. Tonight, we have Professor Robert O'Mealy with us for a presentation on dancers for the Harlem Renaissance, Josephine Baker, Johnny Hudgins, and Jack Johnson. The Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture Series was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history prior to the 19th century. Thank you, Dr. Klein, for continuing to bring these wonderful lectures to the FIA. Thank you also to Communities First, who co-sponsored this lecture and helped us get the word out about it. I would also like to remind you that the next Sheppy Dog Fund lecture will be Thursday, March 16th, in person with Dr. Marcus Cruz on the Catalan Atlas of 1375, the most interesting map in the world. Please join us on March 16th. A quick word about this virtual program before I introduce our speaker. Though we are airing this via Zoom, audience members are muted and your cameras are turned off. If you would like to submit a question, please do so via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We are also broadcasting live via YouTube, and you can enter your questions there as well. The Q&A portion of the program will be after the lecture. If you're at the Flint Institute of Arts tonight, Jenny from Visitor Services is in the audience, who can take your questions and relay it to me. Tonight's speaker, Professor Robert O'Mealy, is the Zora Neale Hurston Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, where he has served on the faculty for 30 years. The founder and former director of Columbia Center for Jazz Studies, O'Mealy is the author of The Craft of Ralph Ellison, Lady Day, The Many Faces of Billie Holiday, The Jazz Singers, and Romare Bearden, A Black Odyssey. For his production of a Smithsonian record set called The Jazz Singers, he was nominated for a Grammy Award. O'Mealy has co-curated exhibitions for the Smithsonian Institution, Jazz at Lincoln Center, and the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. He has held Guggenheim, Cullman, and Library of Congress fellowships, and was a recent fellow at Columbia's new Institute for Ideas and Imagination at the Global Center, Paris. His new books are the Romare Bearden Reader, edited for Duke University Press in 2020, and Antagonistic Cooperation, Collage, Jazz, and American Fiction, Columbia University Press, 2022. Thank you so much, Professor O'Mealy, for being with us tonight. And so now I'm going to turn it over to you as soon as I stop sharing. Welcome.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I will get my talk up here. And before I say anything else, I want to express my gratitude to the Institute and to, in particular, Tracy and Lori, who've been so accommodating to me at a time when I really can't travel, but where I just couldn't wait to make this presentation anyway. Thanks so much for making it happen. I want to look at the Harlem Renaissance from an angle that it's usually not looked at, from the periphery, so to speak. And I'm hoping that from that sideline angle, we'll be able to see the whole picture, or to realize that there is no whole picture, that it's a picture unfurling before our eyes at the moment, and perhaps not completely unfurled indeed. I want to emphasize the fact that these particular artists, and in the case of Jack Johnson, this athlete, these people were influential within their fields, but the influences rippled far beyond their fields as well. They're very important to poetry. They're very important to the visual arts, beyond the ones that they were immediately involved in. So it's that kind of concord of the arts that I think has something to do with the Harlem Renaissance, and I want to emphasize today. I also want to emphasize sports and dance. At Columbia, there's a required curriculum for every student: literature, visual art, music. What about dance? We have cave drawings of dancers going back 20,000 years. And there are those who say that all of the arts derive first from the first of the arts, dance. And whether or not that's true, I want to campaign that this is something that we need to consider when we consider what we need to know as educated people in our time. There are problems defining the Harlem Renaissance that this talk wants to take on. We want to think about when it began, and when it ended, if it did end, what sparked the beginning. If you talk about the European Renaissance, you're talking about centuries across several nations. Why are we in these little 4 and 10-year slots? How do we expand it? What's the point there? Who were the significant participants? If we were to do it right now in a chat, we could name them as Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes and Duke Ellington, and maybe Bessie Smith would make the cut, and then many others, Countess Cullen. But what about other people that we haven't heard of yet, or that might be just as significant? What is the work of the Harlem Renaissance? Where was the Harlem Renaissance? Certainly there is a place called Harlem, and there was a Renaissance there. But the contention in this talk is that there is a Harlem Renaissance in St. Louis, where East St. Louis, where Josephine Baker was from. There was one in Galveston, Texas, where Jack Johnson was from, and in Baltimore. And then we have to think again, where else? What about the Harlem Renaissance in Detroit? How can we think about expanding our sense of definition? I want to get some of the things on my screen somewhat out of the way, you know what I mean, and these chat things. The standard answers to the questions are there. Where did it take place in Harlem, and sometimes DC, where Howard is located? Who were the Harlem Renaissance people? They're writers and painters, and few others. When there are various ways that people arrive at 1919 or 1920, and they go to 1925, or some people say the crash of 29 ended the Harlem Renaissance. The main themes of the Harlem Renaissance were stated very early on, I think very well, by Sterling Brown, who will come up again in this talk. It's more than this, but what are you here for? Things 5, discovery of Africa as a source of race pride, the use of Black heroes and heroic episodes from American history. There's what he called propaganda of protest. We wouldn't phrase it that way, but there's a strong political motive here. There's a treatment of the Negro masses, frequently of the folk, less often of workers, with more understanding and less apology, franker and deeper self-revelation. And so that's when we get these lists in Harlem Renaissance Studies, and that's one of them. And I would suggest that there are more things to add, but we do need to know where to start. I would say get the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. The section on the Harlem Renaissance is so good. And if you're just saying, wait a minute, I need to know who, Countess Cullen, who are some of these people? Norton Anthology, get the 3rd edition is the up-to-date one. The Schomburg is near where I live, and they tell me there that more students come in there wanting to study the Harlem Renaissance than almost anything else. They want to study Malcolm X, they want to study Martin Luther King, and they want to know about the origins of hip hop, but they want to know what the Harlem Renaissance was. And I think there's a cause to look again at this standard set of answers to the standard set of questions. Interdisciplinary studies have made us think about influences across the fields. What about the musicians? What about the athletes? What about filmmakers, actors, architects, dancers, scientists, journalists, fabric artists, clothing designers, business women and men, and others? Once you start to open what about gardeners? Are they in the story as well? And so interdisciplinary studies, global studies have swept the universities. We're increasingly where the American Studies Department now has South America, Central America, the Americas across several languages. And that's true of the Harlem Renaissance as well. As we wonder about somebody like Zora Neale Hurston was very often in the Caribbean. Hughes was very at home in Europe, especially in Paris. And there are others. Du Bois studied in Germany, as did Locke, who had a Rhodes Scholarship in England. So we need to know that, but we also then to say, who are the people who are not Americans, who are part of something beyond what we usually see as the Renaissance? What about what was happening in Africa and the Caribbean and in crossroads cities like Paris, where people from all over the world were coming? Gender studies has made us look again and always ask us, we always have to ask, where are the women, where are the queer members of the congregation, and so on. And we have to get new questions and include new people as we include gender studies as part of Harlem Renaissance studies. We're more than ever at the university aware of the constructedness of cultural knowledge. I don't like that phrase, but what I mean is that you can put together a Harlem Renaissance in Harlem alone. You can make it just fiction or just poetry or just women, but we're aware that you can, no matter how you do it, you're putting something together that could be put together another way. So all of these are answers in progress or provisional looks at what's going on. We're aware now of the creative tension of seeing the Harlem Renaissance as strictly 20s or as a long Harlem Renaissance that may start significantly before and that may involve things that are going on right now. Across the university, as everybody in the room knows, everybody on the chat knows, the archive has meant more, has meant that the past is not what it used to be, so to speak. We go back and we find new players, new activities to consider. We go back to archives that we thought we'd studied thoroughly already, and we find new things. My colleague, Saidiya Hartman, has written a wonderful book, Wayward Lives, where she's looking at figures that are usually not considered as part of the story. There's a series some of you have seen, I bet, the PBS NewsHour has a feature on hidden histories. And so this Robert Smalls, who was enlisted to sail a ship from Africa to Virginia, I believe, when he found he was alone on the ship, he put it in gear and headed to freedom, to pick up other slaves and enslaved people and keep moving. So there are stories that we need to see. There's a woman who was, with her skill as a lawyer, tracking down the New York City mafia bosses in a way that nobody was able to do. She was steadfast and on the case. So there are people at the periphery who are going to move to center stage. I've been finishing a project on Duke Ellington, and I keep running into these people that I never heard of. Bessie Coleman is one. Coleman inspired Duke to write a piece in her honor called Good Queen Bess. She was a flyer at World War I, and she liked to fly over Harlem and entertain her neighbors and friends there. And Ellington wrote this piece, I think, to try to sound a little bit like her in flight. I think Ellington told the saxophonist to try to sound like a plane in flight. Listen here. So I'm going to cut that short. I don't like to interrupt Ellington, but we have to keep moving. He also has a piece called Menelik, honoring the Black Eagle of Harlem, another flyer, Hubert Julian, who was a 1920s Garveyite. Garvey is part of the Harlem Renaissance, to be sure, just as Ellington is. And here's another person from the periphery. And I'll just play like a few seconds of this Ellington piece, where again he's trying to give you the sound of a plane. So if we ask ourselves, what was the Harlem Renaissance? It's a period when things seem possible, where the culture sometimes was open to the notion of a black flyer flying over Harlem, or a black composer imitating the sound of a woman flying over the place. It was a time of possibility. And so in my Harlem Renaissance course, I say, hey, go ahead and create a new syllabus for me. You have my syllabus. And here are some of the ones. I got major women of the Harlem Renaissance, the Negro Leagues, the baseball players, the Harlem Renaissance in Paris, Harlem Renaissance in Martinique is very important. Choreographers of the Harlem Renaissance, Catherine Dunham and others, musicians collectives and unions of the Harlem. How about the rise of gospel music and of tap dance during this period? There are many ways to do it. Where did the great piano players of Detroit come from? They're born in this period, and the parents of the Motown kids are born during this period. What was there in the water that made the Harlem Renaissance in Detroit such an exciting thing? When did it start? Well, we almost always start with 1919, but I love my former colleague Edward Said, who says, look, beginnings are always messy, whether you're talking about human life or you're talking about when did it begin. And we can never be but so sure. And I think it's good just to keep it open and to leave ourselves creatively unsure. When did it begin? Well, one answer would be once slavery is outlawed. That would be one way to say that's the new period. The end of World War I, with all the resources coming and people having traveled, and the global situation, maybe that after the riots of 1919, that's what Gene Toomer was commenting on, that something about the world was different about that. Hughes said that certain productions on Broadway kicked things off as something something new in the air. Oops, I'm having trouble with my not bouncing out of bounds here. Many people start with Alain Locke's New Negro, 1925, as a landmark book that gets the Renaissance started. That's certainly one way to do it. It's a great book. It's amazing how in 1925 he'd gathered so many important writers. He said, last decade something completely different is happening beyond the watch and guard of statistics. There is a new Negro in our midst, a Harlem Renaissance. Sterling Brown, whom I mentioned before, has an important little book, Negro Poetry and Drama, where he gives 1914 and then 36 as the key dates. And he makes the point that Hurston doesn't start her great writing until the 30s. And Hughes is writing in the 30s and he lives into the 70s. So come on, and Du Bois and others don't stop in the 20s. But anyway, that's, and then he associates the Harlem Renaissance with the modernism of Yeats and Eliot and Gertrude Stein and others. And so that little book is very important. I showed you a page from that earlier. He preferred the term New Negro. And I'm fascinated by that because we were aware that this was a time of much discussion of the new woman, the new psychology, new physics and math, negritude, new poetry, and then international modernisms across the arts, obviously in painting, but obviously in literature too, and music. And so this is part of something that's not local, but is international. It's not incorrect to see the Harlem Renaissance as part of the American Renaissance. We had in a few years the incredible presentation of Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, it should be on the list, Mark Twain, Emily Dickinson. Where do we get a list like this? Walt Whitman, Frederick Douglass is not usually on this list, but should be. This incredible outpouring. It makes sense because so many of the Black poets were drawing on Whitman. So many of the Black writers were drawing on Melville and Twain in particular. The poets were very taken by Emily Dickinson and were trying to do their things. And of course, Frederick Douglass was everybody's hero. And so I think that's right to see it's part of that. Sterling Brown was my friend when I taught at Howard. And he said, I asked him about the Harlem Renaissance, and he said, I never could make that team, man. I never could make it. And he was a joker. And he was referring to the fact that the Renaissance Ballroom had a team like the Globetrotters, and they would roll back in the middle of a dance production or a party. There'd be a game. And he said, no, I never could make that team. So, and part of his joke was that there's a lot of different ways to look at what that team really consisted of. One of my witnesses here that I rely on is Edouard Glissant, the Martinican poet and philosopher. And he argues that once you leave slavery, you're giving up a very narrow vision of what you're to do in life that's enforced on you, and you multiply the possibilities. And he says that movement outward reverses the course of enslavement. And so instead of the monotony of slavery and a single life, one multiplies one's sense of self. He says every diaspora is a passage from unity to multiplicity. So that's one way to look at this, that people who were locked as a laundress or locked down as a cotton picker now can think of themselves as many other things. I like to put Douglass in the story, and in a moment in his 1845 narrative where he says he'd been beaten and beaten, and finally the slave driver told him to come over and take a beating, and he said, "From whence came the spirit, I know not, but I turned and told that man, you might fight me and beat me, but you will never beat me again." And that turn, he helps mark his movement from slavery to freedom. I resolved that however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I would be a slave in fact. Something about that kind of moment, that when everything changes. This wonderful woman, Harriet Jacobs, decided that she would escape into the house of the people who so-called owned her. She didn't want to leave her children behind, so she could watch them from what she called a loophole of retreat up in the roof of the building where the big house, so to speak, and she waited for her moment. And then what I love about this is the courage involved, and also the fact that so many artists, Simone Leaves is one of them, were inspired by this idea of a loophole of retreat, something about the position of being a person in this world, especially the woman, in need of a place where you can retreat, where you can surveil the scene, where you can protect your children to a degree and your family while you plot your way out. This is my dear friend, Hortense Spillers, who makes much of this. And she says, the critic Valerie Smith's reading of the tale of Linda Brent is a tale of garroting, of hiding upstairs in the attic, enables our notion that female gender for captive women's community is the tale ripped between the lines and in the not quite spaces of an American domesticity. It's this tale that we try to make cleaner, or keeping with the metaphor, bring in line. So all of this by way of preface to my idea of what the Harlem Renaissance is. I love that Ralph Ellison, the writer of Invisible Man, the novel, said that the Harlem Renaissance was a sophisticated moment, a moment of great transition when we were far enough from the traumas of Reconstruction, the disappointments of Reconstruction, to begin to think of leadership on a very, very broad scale. That idea of a sophisticated moment, I think, is very significant and interesting to me. Gerald Early, the great critic at Washington, St. Louis, the scholar, said, you could begin the Harlem Renaissance when Jack Johnson won the heavyweight championship. He said that would be one way to look at it. He said people who never heard of Langston Hughes or Zora Neale Hurston or Countee Cullen, they knew this. This picture was in every barbershop in Black America. And this, he says, gave a new sense of possibility against what everybody had said was possible for a Black man. Here was Jack Johnson, now the heavyweight champion of the world, 1908, 1915. I like putting him in the story, at least provisionally as a start. He's one of the starting places because he's born in Galveston, Texas. Galveston, Texas is the town associated with Juneteenth. It's the very town, among others, where the word of emancipation was delayed. And that idea of that we're still waiting for Juneteenth to arrive, and that he was born in that town is part of what's, I think, attractive about him as a starting place. Juneteenth as a name for the ongoing search for the meaning of freedom, that never-ending struggle that's physical as well as metaphysical. Johnson came along at a time when moving pictures were just beginning to be shown everywhere. And some historians call him the first Black movie star. The films of his fights were shown everywhere. The fight where he knocks out Jim Jeffries was so dramatically contradictory to white supremacy that the cameramen agreed to stop the film. But what survived is very, very telling, and the fact that they stopped it is part of the story too. Here you see him listed among these early films that were shown everywhere, sometimes underground, sometimes secretly, but they've survived, and interesting to see them. It was Johnson who has inspired many musicians, to write pieces about him, including this amateur boxer, Miles Davis. He has a wonderful record. It's called Jack Johnson. And he talks about how important it was to him, as somebody who was an amateur boxer on his own, how important it was for him to try to figure out what it would sound like to be Jack Johnson at work. That record is important as part of the Harlem Renaissance, if you will, though it comes in the 1970s, because it represents a new way of recording. He just let the tapes roll and told the engineers not to interfere with them. He just taped everything, and then we'd go back in and edit down and see what we have. And so that record is quite interesting as far as all that goes. It was the soundtrack for an early documentary about Jack Johnson, and I'll play you just a couple of minutes of that Jack Johnson documentary with Miles Davis's soundtrack accompanying. It's Brock Peters who's doing the narration.
My great thrill is stepping into the ring, feeling rosin under my feet, waiting for the sound of the bell. Some fighters say they're nervous in the ring. Others feel fear. But me, I feel happy. I've been everywhere, seen everything, done everything. But most of all, I like doing what I do, in front of a crowd. I like the sound of cylinders popping. I like the blur of faces at 90 miles an hour. I like the spray of dirt on a fast turn. Behind the wheel, I feel good. Champagne cork, fine clothes, and lots of spending money. The smile of a pretty woman. I like life, and I like it now. I'm Jack Johnson, heavyweight champion of the world. I'm black. They never let me forget it. I'm black, all right. I'll never let them forget it.
When the heavyweight champion refused to fight Johnson because he said it would be cruel to mistreat an animal in the ring, he would beat him up so badly it wasn't fair. Johnson began traveling with the champ and daring him. He said, "I'll fight you anywhere, anytime." And eventually, somebody put up so much money that the challenge was irresistible. He was a bold character. Du Bois used the phrase "unforgivable blackness," which Ken Burns picked up on in his superb documentary about Jack Johnson, with Wynton Marsalis doing a superb musical score to go along with it. Johnson played the bass himself. He was a pretty good dancer himself. He was the subject of this documentary and musical score, and then one before it. Let's see a little bit of that documentary. He was a legendary man. He was celebrated in poetry and stories. As again, my friend Sterling Brown wrote this great poem, I think, Strange Legacies, 1932. He says, "One thing you left with us, Jack Johnson, one thing before they got you. You used to stand there like a man taking punishment with a golden, spacious grin, confident inviting big Jim Jeffries in, who was Jim Jeffries, who was boring in. Here I is, big boy. You sees where I was at. Come on in. Thanks, Jack, for that. It's worth looking up that poem, Strange Legacies, and worth looking again at Sterling Brown. So if we go down, we have to go down. We go down like you, brother, natural men. He's celebrated also by James Weldon Johnson, who in his autobiography talks to Johnson, a very refined and overeducated, one might say, man. He says, it's easy to like Jack Johnson. He's so likable, man. I liked him particularly well. I was, of course, impressed by his huge but perfect form, terrible strength, and the supreme ease and grace of his every muscular movement. However, watching his face, sad until he smiled, listening to his soft Southern speech and laughter, hearing him talk so wistfully about his big chance yet to come, I found it difficult to think of him as a prize fighter. I'd not seen a prize fight, but I conceived of the game as a brutal, bloody one, demanding of its opponents courage, stamina, brute force, as well as skill, quick intelligence. And I could hardly figure gentle Jack Johnson in the role. Boxers wanted to be the new Jack Johnson, black and white. Not just the black ones, but the white hopes, as they call them, to try to knock him down. And others dreamed of becoming the Jack Johnson of literature or whatever else they were doing, just as Sterling Brown says, thanks, Jack, for that. Ellison, in a letter to his friend, the novelist Albert Murray, said, when writing, I learned from Joe Lewis, and Sugar Ray Robinson, though that old dancing master, wit, bald stud Jack Johnson is really my mentor, because he knew that if you operated with skill and style, you could rise above all that being a credit to your race crap, because he was a credit to the human race. And because if he could make that much body and bone move with such precision as at his command, all other men had a chance to beat the laws of probability and anything else that stuck up its head. Ellison went on to say, one thing must be said of Richard Wright. In him, we had for the first time a Negro American writer as randy, as courageous, as irrepressible as Jack Johnson. Albert Murray himself, in his terrific novel, Train Whistle Guitar, talks about Jack Johnson. He said there was a cement sack punching bag hanging heavyweight high from the lowest branch of the chinaberry tree, plus also a narrow circle that you were supposed to stand up and step into when little Buddy said ching-a-ling. I crossed old John L. Sullivan's color line every time I stepped into the workout circle around the punching bag. So he's inspiring writers. He's also just inspiring this sophisticated moment, this new sense of possibility. Let's look back now at this unforgivable blackness. As I say, the phrase came from W.E.B. Du Bois, who's writing in defense of Jack Johnson. And here's a little clip.
For more than 13 years, Jack Johnson was the most famous and the most notorious African American on earth. He battled his way from obscurity to the top of the heavyweight ranks, won the greatest prize in American sports, a prize that had always been the private preserve of white combatants, then suffered persecution at the hands of his own government, and years of exile before the title was taken from him. And he did all these things during the years which marked the low point of African American life after emancipation. Abandoned by the federal government, denied the vote if they lived below the Mason-Dixon line, and living under the constant threat of mob violence, Black Americans at the turn of the 20th century were no longer enslaved, but not yet truly free. Jack Johnson insisted on being free. When whites ran everything, Jack Johnson took orders from no one. While most African Americans struggled merely to survive, Jack Johnson reveled in his riches and his fame. When Black Americans were expected to defer to whites, Jack Johnson battered them to the ground. And at a time when the mere suspicion that a black man had flirted with a white woman could cost him his life, Jack Johnson slept with whomever he pleased. To most whites, and to some African Americans, Johnson was a perpetual threat, profligate, arrogant, amoral, a dark menace, and a danger to the natural order of things. The real Jack Johnson was both more and less than those who loved or those who hated him ever knew. Just remember, he told a young reporter not long before he died, whatever you write about me, that I was a man.
Wonderful score by Wynton, and narration by Keith David. Just beautiful. One more clip from that Unforgivable Blackness.
On the morning of July 4th, 1910, 15 special trains pulled into the little desert town of Reno, Nevada. Aboard were thousands of white men who had paid their way across the country to see a prize fight unlike any that had ever taken place before. They had come to see their hero, the white ex-heavyweight champion Jim Jeffries, take back the title from the first African-American ever to hold it, Jack Johnson. It was, said the Chicago Tribune, going to be a contest between the white man's hope and the black peril. Somehow, in the minds of many white Americans, this boxing match would decide whose country America really was. Who was meant to be in charge.
My colleague Charles Daniel Dawson talked about how so many white fighters have been called Rocky or something like that, and so many black fighters have been called Chocolate or Sugar or something like that. And he says that there's a different approach that the African American tradition represents in sports that has to do with a kind of dance beat orientation. And he also says there's a trickiness, there's a will to hold back and to strategize, what Danny calls tricknology that's part of this. Stanley Crouch is my buddy. I miss him so much. And he said that Jack Johnson's strategy was to enlist his opponents in the project of kicking their own asses. So he would duck and finally get you in and help you to bring you down. Of course, Muhammad Ali was inspired by Johnson and talked about him all through the career. And he was also floating like a butterfly, stinging like a bee, so fast, understated, flashy living, the great Muhammad Ali. I want to close this part of my talk with some footage of Winston in rehearsal with his band as they're working out a soundtrack to the Jack Johnson film. This piece is just simply called What Have I Done? And you see young Wynton, this is about 15 years ago, and he's just in rehearsal working on it. It has a gospel sound, a blues sound. has a work song sound. I hate to interrupt Winton too. Look it up online. You can find that the rehearsal of the Unforgivable Blackness with Wynton Marsalis, and it's interesting to watch him letting the piece evolve and to think about it as a kind of work song, blues, gospel, a song, and to ask ourselves, what had Johnson done? What had he done? Well, with his fists, he'd shattered the myth of white supremacy and of black male stereotypes. He lived in defiance of the deficit model of black life, living large with cars, hats, clothes, jewelry, travel. He traveled with prostitutes, and some of them he eventually married, had white wives and girlfriends without apology. This is what finally brought him down. He was openly critical of racism in the United States, spoke unsparingly of white boxers who disrespected him and punished them in the ring. He would say, no, you're not knocked out yet. I'm not through with you yet, after they talked about him so bad. So he was a Renaissance man. He was an avid reader. He spoke several languages. He was a real estate company man. He did a lot of different things. And he had represented for me that spirit of the sophisticated moment. Johnny Hudgins is a completely different case. He's born at the turn of the century in Baltimore and was a dancer who made his mark as a blackface dancer. That is, he was black, but he would also put on the black grease paint and appear that way. I start with this slide by Romari Bearden, subtitled or captioned, "He was my favorite of all the comedians," Bearden wrote. What Johnny Hudgins could do through mime on an empty stage helped show me how words were created on an empty canvas. So I think it's very significant that he's looking across the line at another artist to inspire him as a visual artist. Okay, wait a minute. So I think it's interesting to see him alongside. Is that Florence Mills on the background? On the left, it could be Josephine. Chick Webb of Baltimore is in the lower right-hand corner. The Lafayette Theater and the theaters are also institutions that are part of this story. He's definitely from the sidelines, because who would expect a black-faced comedian to be a part of this? Here's another Bearden portrait of Johnny Hudgins, this time with Ellington in the lower right-hand corner. And now Johnny Hudgins is associated with important Renaissance sites. The Apollo, you see the big sign in the middle, Smalls down the left, the Cotton Club on the right. All of these are part of what gives the young artist Romari Bearden, who's coming of age during the Harlem Renaissance, a sense of possibility. Baldwin, also born in Harlem, 1924, right at the height of what some people call the Renaissance, and his teacher was Count Cullen, and he knew Ellington and all the rest of them. And he said in his essay called "The Devil Finds Work" about movies, what the black actor has managed to give are moments, indelible moments created miraculously beyond the confines of the script, hints of reality smuggled like contraband into a maudlin tale, and with enough force, if unleashed, to shatter the tale to fragments. And I think that's part of what Hudgins was able to do. Never mind the blackface, never mind all the trappings. He's doing things with his body that express some of the audacity that we saw in Jack Johnson. Baldwin recommends, by the way, seeing certain films in Harlem theaters where sentimental scenes often provoked laughter. This the film that we'll see shortly has some themes to laugh at, but I think about what the Black viewers might be laughing at. I also think we have to look again at our blacked up performers. Pigmeat Markham was one of the most famous ones. My hero, Ralph Ellison, says that his humor is as close to Shakespeare as anything you find in the United States in American literature, even in its uses of the bladder. I wish some critic would make a study of this. And I think Johnny Hudgins, too, was fantastic in his presentation. Don't forget that Josephine Baker also appeared in blackface. She appeared in whiteface. In one of her movies, she dropped into a flour sack and comes out like this. Johnny Hudgins appears in an important little film of 1927 by Jean Renoir. And I want to show you a clip of that film where we get to see him dancing. And once again, you have to look for the genius that's there anyway. An archival treasure offering one of the fullest accounts of the stage act of Johnny Hudgins, his styles of comic dance, and of the Charleston in particular, of which he was masterful. Speaking of archives, I've spent time at Emory and some time at Columbia, where there are fantastic holdings on Johnny Hudgins, big scrapbooks showing him traveling through South America and through Europe and all through the States. And in his time, though he's disappeared now, he was one of the most popular Black performers. Here he is demonstrating the cakewalk in a film of 1925 called A Night from Dixie. It's one of those scenes where people come forth doing the cakewalk, but watch what Johnny does. So here's one couple coming up and then another. Here comes Johnny Hudgins now. Watch the steps he does. He was moonwalking before Michael knew what it was. So he's influencing everybody who saw him, including Josephine. Here's another clip where we see him in action. He was sued by his act was stolen by a Broadway show choreographer, and Johnny took her to court and won the case. He said, "Those are my steps you're doing." Watch him in action here. This is a silent film. And so you think about Bearden saying what you could do on an empty stage showed him what could be done on an empty canvas. And once again, never mind all the trappings, but watch the skill here. Some books say he invented the Charleston, which is certainly not true, but he certainly was one of those popularizing it and popularizing other dances that made their ways onto the American stage. He never made it in talking films because he couldn't read. And so he couldn't handle the scripts, and that was sort of the end of his career. He had been a silent film and stage star, and then gone completely from the public eye. And he and Josephine are part of the overseas story of the international Harlem Renaissance story. They appeared in Chocolate Dandies and were soon after that taking off for Paris. He was a big draw, as I say, in Europe and South America, and very, very popular at the theaters in Harlem. Hudgins, by the way, accused Josephine Baker of stealing aspects of his comic style, but these things were shared. It's hard to say who stole what from whom. They both were strong personalities. You can see Johnny now without blackface, a very elegant dresser, as was Josephine, of course. This makes us think again about the Harlem Renaissance team. And many would cut the dancer from the team, certainly the dancer in blackface, but maybe he belongs there after all. Maybe it's not just the cities that we usually think of, not just the North, but the South, not just the US, but the diaspora. A global modernism is what we might consider here, not just poetry and novels, but music, film, and dance, not just the arts, but politics, journalism, sports, science, not just the 20s. Is the Harlem Renaissance going on right now? Dance is the hardest thing to record. The cameras usually get it wrong. They'll be watching the torso when it's the feet that are doing things. You need to see the whole pattern. The written accounts are unreliable. Every performer and every performance is different. And so it's not part of what we study in the university, but there's a record there that I think we're going to learn to retrieve one of these days. There's several good books on Black dance. The key one is in the middle there, Jazz Dance by Marshall and Gene Stearns. But there are other very good ones, including the one on the left by Jackie Malone and then others. Bearden said he thought the greatest sculpture in the United States was being created on the public dance ballroom floors. He said, where are the American sculptures? Go to the dance halls and watch those people move, and you'll see them. He also was aware that these dances had ritual functions. And so when people danced and fell out, as they say in church, they looked closely at the lower right-hand corner, and there are dancers there now doing the holy dance, the spiritually full possession dance. It's part of the story here. These were important to the community, important dances, sacred and secular. The fact that it's the Charleston that he's doing is significant, and I won't go into all of that here, but the Charleston is very significant to dance history. Although its origins are unclear, it probably originated in the South, considering its name, then was brought north with migrating workers. Marshall Stearns reports its existence in about 1904. Honey Cole saw it in 1916 in Philadelphia. So the Charleston story is part of what we get here. The dancer and the singer and the instrumentalist comprised what Sterling Brown called a triumvirate in Black America. And it's interesting to look at his paintings with the dancer and the singer and the band in the lower right-hand corner with that kind of triumphancy in mind. Of course, I'm, as a scholar, wrestling with the fact that Hudgins appeared in blackface when we know that it was associated with minstrelsy, with ridiculing Black people, associated with rituals asserting white power. So that's something we have to put into the story as well. But we also have to remember that we are, as Americans, a land of masking jokers. We wear the mask for purposes of aggression as well as for defense, Ellison says, when we're projecting the future or preserving the past. The motives hidden behind the mask are as numerous as the ambiguities that the mask conceals. We Wear the Mask is the name of a great poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, where he says, why should the world be otherwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see while we wear the mask, pretending to be less or more or something other than what you are in order to assert a certain sense of freedom. In Romari Bearden's paintings, very often the musicians' masks suggest an African lineage and suggest that they are agents of power. In his photograph, in his collages with photographs and elsewhere. So E. Cummings said, damn everything but the circus. The average painter, sculptor, all the rest of them can't leap through a hoop from the back of a galloping horse. So it's interesting to think of him as a comic associated with the circus. I'll finish with this Heir of a Charleston, which I mentioned before. I can't show the whole thing because it's 20 minutes, but I'll just give you a little bit of it. Courtney Bryan composed a score for this silent film, and you'll hear bits and pieces of that. What's weird here is that it's a science fiction film in which Johnny Hudgins gets into a spacecraft and sails from Africa to Europe, which has been bombed away in the war. And so we're told in the film that a few years after the last war, the astronaut or the airman takes off from Central Africa. This is very primitive filmmaking. It's 1927. There's Johnny supposedly looking down at the world, traveling north from Africa. Europe has been bombed to nothing. That's part of the story here. It's a post-World War I fantasy. And when he lands, he finds the last of the Europeans is a woman who's there with a gorilla in what had once been Paris. And they meet one another, and she begins to do the Charleston. And he says, oh my goodness, that's the ancient dance. And she's going to show him how to do it. This is Catherine Herring, who's the wife of the filmmaker. So she's going to teach him the Charleston, and he's a pretty good student at it. Those are the ancestors looking down. She's still, according to the film, teaching him to do the Charleston. Of course, he is the inventor of this dance, and he can Charleston her into the ground. She's not bad, you know. There's the gorilla who's left there. And then finally, he takes off in the rocket and heads back to Africa with her. They leave the gorilla behind. He's heartbroken. And off into the sky they go. So look this up. You'll find it on the web. Heir of a Charleston, Jean Renoir film starring Johnny Hudgins. Here's Courtney, the Bryan, the composer. And again, it's looking through the offensive material, looking through muddy water, as the folk expression goes, and seeing dry land. I want to end with Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker is more than just the bananas we know now. She was a dancer extraordinaire and a world citizen, just a great person who's been celebrated quite a bit in the last couple of years. We know her as Josephine in movies as the caged bird. We know her as the Lady of the Bananas, the singer of the song J'ai deux amours. We know her as the Lady Dressed to Kill, the fashion leader. We also know her as someone who was undressed to kill. If anybody ever captured the sophisticated moment and the specialness of this period, it was Josephine Baker. Cross-dressed to kill whenever she felt like doing that. She was a soldier in the resistance, crossing lines and using her charms to work for the French resistance. She's honored now as a hero, a military hero. She adopted children across these racial lines and became a kind of symbol of rising above racism. I saw her at the 1963 March on Washington. We forget that she was there. Mahalia Jackson, Martin Luther King, and others were there, but there she was as well. And now we know that she's the first Black woman to enter France's Pantheon. Just a year and a half ago, she was named. You can go to the 14th arrondissement and see the Place Josephine, Becker, as they say. It also excites me that we read about architects, painters, sculptors who were taken by the example of Josephine Baker. Second Skin is a study by Anne Chang that takes this seriously. And so let's look at her as a dancer. She's one of the co-inventors of modern dance, I think. Not alone, but she's important. Balanchine loved her and featured. Let's watch it for a moment through the Charleston. She was charismatic. And she knew how to move. I read recently that Mondrian just loved Josephine. And so here's Lynn Whitfield, who was assigned the role of Josephine Baker in a documentary about her, and she talks about how hard it was to learn how to play that role.
In order to prepare to, in any way, do justice to Josephine, to give just an inkling of an impression of her spirit through her dance, I took samba, Brazilian dancing, modern, jazz. George Faison, who choreographed me in it, locked me in the dance studio and would not let me out for 8 hours a day. I was crying and begging, please let, a stand-in do this. But the minute he found out I could move, and so it took all of that to capture even a little bit of the madness and just individuality that she had. I don't know where God just put something in her when it came to that.
She was born in East St. Louis and driven out by the tremendous fire and riots there. And it's something, if you read the novel called Jazz by Toni Morrison, there's a character named Dorcas who's based on Josephine Baker, who becomes a kind of spirit of that novel. The brilliant young woman whose life is cut short. So if you read Jazz, and you'll see Josephine makes an appearance here. She showed up in Paris and was a hit almost right from the beginning. She's eventually in Le Vieux Negre, She's celebrated by Paul Collin and other visual artists. Supposedly, as she arrived, this is one account of it. Let me see if I can get this. On the platform descending from the transatlantic train, a bustling little group, noisy, multicolored bearers of bizarre instruments bursting with laughter, skirts colored red, green, and saffron, jeans the color of raspberries, under an extravagant piece of headgear and wearing black and white checkered gardener's overalls, a long-bodied, supple young woman detached herself from the technicolored group and advanced toward us. "And so this is Paris," she cried. That was Josephine Baker's first utterance before the conquest. So this was Paris. There she is with Sidney Bechet beside her, the great saxophonist, clarinetist arriving in Paris at that same moment. When she was in a film or on stage, you just couldn't take your eyes off her. She was a comedian, as I've mentioned before. She was in the tradition of Lucille Ball. She was a fantastic sense of style. There are these stores in Paris now, the Tam Tam, which tell you should undress like a princess, with Josephine in mind, and with this movie Tam Tam in particular in mind. She was famous for this dance. This is a censored version of it. She's got clothes on, which she didn't have when she performed it in Paris. It's not a very good clip, but you get an idea of what she was doing. Here she comes.
A hand-painted version of the famous banana dance recently came to light in America. It was probably shown to cinema goers as a short film before the main feature. Censors saw to it that Josephine was dressed rather more modestly than she was for Paris audiences, but the setting is exactly the same. This is Josephine Baker on the stage of the Folies Bergère at a moment of music hall history.
Okay, I have a couple more clips to show you as I work toward an ending now. There were those who really did not approve of Josephine Baker's performance. And I think it's very interesting to put the Nardal sisters, please look them up if you don't know who they are, and to put Brent Edwards, whom we'll see in a moment, into the story of what many Black people felt about Josephine Baker's performance.
Some Black intellectuals were uncomfortable with Black American behavior in Paris. In the article Exotic Puppets, Jane Nardal criticized Josephine Baker, saying that she reinforced French stereotypes of Black women as primitive, exotic sexual beings.
The Nardal sisters were from Martinique in the French Caribbean, and they were university educated, very upper class, and they were horrified by the specter of a Josephine Baker.
Jane Nardal is really trying to get at how Blacks in general are frozen into these stereotypes, and how they're how they're regurgitated at different times and different moments. And in this particular case, they're put to use to frame the French fascination with Blackness.
The famous banana skirt, which soon became one of her trademark legends, was, as the literary critic Phyllis Roses put it, a perfect mingling of sexuality and primitivism. The stiff, erect banana hung around this woman's, or this girl's waist. And so, absolutely, she does feed into French, especially French masculine fantasies about the colonies.
The 1931 colonial exposition in the Bois de Vincennes, when the French celebrated the colonial world. You see what incredible pride the French felt the depth of their belittlement of cultures around the world and their sense that they owned, controlled, managed, packaged their own colonial empire. At the same time that the French were making an effort to welcome the African American expatriate or the African American artist, to say there's no racial prejudice here, to critique American racism left and right, to say, oh, lynching, we're so disturbed at what goes on in the US South. But at the same time, to forget, conveniently, what was going on in Indochina, where there were the same levels of violent repression, or in parts of French West Africa.
In many of her stage performances of films, Josephine Baker is a representative of the colonialist fantasies of the French, especially the fantasies of colonial women of color, as alluring, sensual, and ultimately in love with French men.
Princess Tam Tam in particular, she certainly acts out the sexuality, the woman who needs to be guided, who needs to be educated. She embodies the French civilizing mission, or what the civilizing mission is there to do. So the film itself transports people to these various places, and they could see the natives at play and why the French presence is so necessary there.
Okay, I want to take one more look at this Princess Tam Tam and ask about that dance that Josephine's doing. In the middle of the film, she decides to take off the formal French gown that she's got on and to perform a dance. And to me, it's very significant, again, to look through muddy water and see dry land, and to see that she's in this film where she's cast as a stereotype, but toward the end, she does a dance that's outlawed in the Caribbean, many parts of the Caribbean, because it was so associated with rebellion and revolution. It was frowned upon in France for the same reason. And she comes out there doing it as if it's nothing. And that's part of the story too, the subversiveness of this woman. Here she's about to run down the stairs and decide she's not going to be in the show. She's going to do the conga. The people who hate her are hoping she'll embarrass herself. She's doing a very authentic version of this dance. Okay. I'm all done now. She was a soldier. She was a civil rights spokesperson, activist. She marched with King. She spoke about the responsibility of the adults to overcome racism and bring up the next generation. She was the first Black woman in the French Pantheon. And if we ask ourselves, when does the Harlem Renaissance end? Some people say the Depression. Some people say when Richard Wright enters the scene. Some people talk about bebop music as the end. Gerald Early says it ended when Jack Johnson was replaced by soft-spoken Joe Louis. But maybe one way to say that it ended was when this wonderful woman was no longer on the scene. When Johnny Hudgins and tap dance were no longer done. But above all, when this lady in particular, with this tremendous sense of possibility, this tremendous sense of sophistication in the moment was the Harlem Renaissance personified. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor O'Mealy. That was just so fascinating. I really enjoyed it. We do have time for a couple of questions. So if anyone has a question for him, please put it in the Q&A or on the chat box in the YouTube channel. So I'll wait a few seconds to see if there's any questions that come in. So far, we don't have any, but I'll just wait a few moments. And there's a delay on the YouTube channel, so I'm kind of looking at both just to see. Also, I have a question until someone chimes in. Out of the three dancers that you've talked about today, who are you most intrigued by or wish you could learn more about?
Well, that's maybe too hard a question, honestly. But because I'm intrigued by all of them, I have to say that at the moment it's Jack Johnson, because there he is. He went to Mexico and encouraged African Americans. He said, let's move out. Let's try someplace else. The experiment isn't working. And he was so audacious. You wonder where on the earth the courage came from. And at the end, when he could no longer box, he went on stage with his fiddle and
Wow.
and then dancing. But Josephine, you can't beat Josephine. So that's for me. She's endlessly fascinating, endlessly fascinating. And every time I go to certain parts of Paris where you see markers celebrating her, you think, wow, it was so smart of her to escape the burnout St. Louis and become everything she could become, and then come back to bring that cosmopolitan unruliness on home. So she's there too. And I do love Hudgins, because he's totally unknown, I think. But he's in this science fiction film,
Right.
and he takes Agnes de Mille to court and says, "Look, that's my dad," and then wins. So he's a, and the fact I've written books, as you mentioned, on I'm just finishing a little book on Bearden, and Bearden was fascinated by Hudgins and did portraits of him again and again, and so that makes me wonder about. Novelists attending ABT here in New York, or waiting to see the Ailey Company and drawing what they can from all of that in their own art.
Well, thank you. We do have a couple questions that came in. So one is from Patricia, who writes, "Your enthusiastic presentation was fascinating. What will it take to get people to realize this is such an important part of American history?"
Well, I think thank you, Patricia, for the question. I think that as the media becomes more attentive to this, thank goodness for PBS, but also Netflix and other vehicles have had very good documentaries about James Baldwin, very good plays by August Wilson, showcases for some of these great people. And I just think that as the different vehicles that we have, the media and also the schools, that's why the fight in Florida is very important. I understand that the school board wanted the students to see primary text rather than secondary text, but that's not what the people who are making the big fuss are talking about. They just don't want to hear about Black American achievement. And we have to fight them and make sure that our kids are finding out about these great people. And it may be that Duke Ellington was the greatest composer in our country. We need our kids to hear that music. And when they do, they're floored by it. They can hardly believe it. And so I just think it's a matter of using the vehicles that we have to get the word out.
One more question, or actually two more questions that came in. So there's a few people that are here at the FIA in the audience. And so these questions are from them. One of them says, were there any architectural advancements during the Harlem Renaissance? Any notable structures?
Now, I have to say that I know too little about that to give a coherent answer. I do know that yes is the answer, but what those architectural advancements were, I don't know. There's a history of African American architectural work that's yet to be told. The part all the way back to the designing of Washington, D.C. and of the building of those buildings and the design of them. As I mentioned, I've been reading about architects who watched Josephine, and that might be one place to start. But I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that. I know it's there, but I don't know where it is yet. I haven't gotten there.
And then this other is actually a comment, not a question. It's about blackface. It says, with other derogatory things associated with African Americans, we can take them and make them our own. Example, stormy weather, two men in a car that breaks down, great humor.
Well, I am so in league with the person making this comment. So often, Louis Armstrong is playing a role. He's feeding his family. He's playing the roles that were available to him. And then I think Baldwin is right. You're doing what you can to sort of peek around the mask and say, hey, man, you know what? There's a lot of talent that goes with this. And he tries to complicate the meaning. And I think that it's dead right that stormy weather shows that the capacity to rise above and to make something out of nothing. It's almost like the tradition of quilting, where you're taking grandpa's jeans and the old worn out blanket and making it into something beautiful. It's making lemonade out of what you got. That's the story of Black America, coming up with something out of what seems like absolutely nothing, something out of what is intended to make fun of you and to hate you, and you rise above it and make something that celebrates your community. It's a miracle.
And this is the final question, is from Kathy. And she writes, what role would you see Idlewild, Michigan play in the Renaissance period? Many prominent people had homes in what was called Black Eden.
That's right. I'm aware of that community, and I'm so glad to hear about Idlewild. And I think there's a study of the geographical history of African Americans that's yet to be told in full. The decision to rise up and leave Alabama and establish a city in Oklahoma, just to go to the territory and start all over again. Parts of the story of Tulsa, the story of Black DC, where I grew up, is very, in Idlewild, you've got these kind of Black Wall Streets and Black Broadways all over the country. That's why I object to people overemphasizing Harlem. Yes, Harlem, but what about Mobile? And what about Thelonious Monk was born in North Carolina, and so was Max Roach, and so was Nina Simone. And so we have to broaden our sense of things. I don't know a great deal about the Idlewild, but I'm ready to learn, and I'm convinced in advance that there's a Harlem Renaissance story from that town.
Well, thank you so much. I know everyone enjoyed it, and I learned so much tonight. I also want to mention to the audience that we have invited Professor O'Mealy back. We don't have a date yet, but hopefully that next time he'll come back in person. And so on a different topic there, and obviously there's so much more to explore within just this category. So we're very excited, and we'll announce the details of that as soon as we can get them out to you. Thank you again to Dr. Alan Klein for sponsoring this lecture, and for Communities First for co-sponsoring. And we hope you all have a great evening. And thank you again, Professor O'Mealy.
Thanks to you. It's been my
Thank
pleasure.
you.